Good afternoon and welcome to Black Cambridge and COVID-19. We are excited to come to you today and have a conversation about getting out the vote. We are so close to our reelection, and full disclosure, this program will not reflect the opinions of CCTV. But we will get into some politics here. We will have, of course, a bipartisan as well as a partisan conversation about our upcoming presidential election and all the races that will be on the ballot as well. I'm elated, of course, to be joined by my esteemed co-host, former mayor and city councilor Denise Simmons, who has graciously agreed to be on this journey of doing this program with us to really talk about the current issues that's impacting the Black community in the context of us dealing with this still very significant crises of managing a pandemic. So we're going to kick it off to Denise before we introduce our guests and get into the conversation. So Denise?
Thanks, Manikka, and thanks to all of you that are joining us today. We are on the precipice. We are standing on the threshold of an important election. And Manikka and I, as we are thinking about what we wanted to do with the support of CCTV, that it keeps encouraging us to stay in good trouble, we encourage us to do this conversation around voting. And what does voting mean? Manikka and I are both elected officials, so we understand the importance of voting. That's how we stay in our job. But to you, the citizens, what does voting mean? What does voting mean particularly to the Black community? When I think of my family, we always equated voting with our voice. Our voice, our way of giving our opinion on how we wanted our city, our state, in our country to run and how we wanted it to represent us. And although Cambridge may not have any what I would call overt voter suppression, we have to have a conversation that says, we want you to be informed, we want you to be engaged, we certainly want you to come out, because anytime you do not, your voice is not heard. Some of us, particularly African Americans, as you all, or many of you know, have struggled long and hard for this very precious right. Not that long ago, we had a conversation that sort of danced around the Voting Rights Act when we talked about women's suffrage. And, it's the 100th year and we're talking about suffrage, but the reality of the situation was Black women would not get that precious right until 45, 50 years later. So voting is so incredibly important to our community. So I'm happy to have this conversation. I can't wait to hear our speakers, who are extraordinary individuals to collectively in their own right. So I look forward to this conversation. Glad that you're tuning in. Manikka, I'm going to turn it back to you, my very capable, competent co-moderator. Take it away.
Wonderful, Denise. So let's introduce our speakers. So we have Anthony Collins, who is a part of the coordinated campaign for the Democratic Party, as well as work with Ed Markey. He is a director there. So welcome, Anthony. We have Elizabeth Bowman, who is the vice president of the Cambridge Democratic Committee. I got that right, Elizabeth? Wonderful. And we have Larry Ward, who sits on our Cambridge Election Commission. So before we get to our speakers, I thought I would just give us some updates on the numbers of where we are with COVID-19 in the context of getting out the vote. So right now in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we have 1,128 newly reported confirmed COVID cases. We have a total in the state of 146,028 additional cases. That represents the total of all cases in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We have a positivity rate of 1.5 throughout the Commonwealth. And just to let you know, that is actually on the rise. As of September, our positivity rate was 1.1%. So that's a 4-point increase. Now, granted, that's not enormous, but it's something that we need to be paying attention to. As it relates to Cambridge, we had a reported new cases of 10. Our total confirmed cases is 1,517. And our daily 7-day average is about 1.1 1%. We are in the yellow category according to the statewide categories of how they designate community safety as it relates to the transmission of COVID-19. So while we're doing really good in the city of Cambridge, and I just want to thank our residents. Every time I leave my house, I see how our residents, they could be walking down the street by themselves. They have that mask on. And because of that dedication and commitment, that's why our rates are pretty steady, but we have to be vigilant. And particularly since I am, vice chair of the Cambridge School Committee, I want to even push people to stay committed because we started our in-person learning program and we want to keep our kids in school. So please be mindful of, how we're tackling this pandemic because it is still very much a threat. Now let's talk about voting in the context of those numbers. Across the country, we've seen record-breaking numbers when it comes to early voting, which is really remarkable compared to our last presidential election. Right now, numbers across the country is coming in at 56 million Americans have already casted their ballots. That is remarkable. I'm curious what we are looking like here in Cambridge. So Larry, kick us off. What should we know about our early voting turnout, and what does in-person voting look like in the context of COVID-19?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me on. I think what you and Denise Simmons are doing is just an unbelievable task that you've taken on and have successfully managed it. So Cambridge, I am proud to report we're doing very well. I'll start off with just some overall numbers. We have about 73,500 registered voters in Cambridge, which is fairly high with a city of, I think, slightly over 100,000 residents. So that's pretty good. We have mailed out over 36,000 ballots so far for early people who want to get a ballot and vote by mail. And I should add also the deadline for getting that early ballot voting in mail is Wednesday. For all the people watching, and let's make sure we let as many people as we know that if they want to get a ballot in the mail, they need to do it by Wednesday. We need to get that paperwork. I would strongly suggest at this point to put it in one of the 6 drop boxes in Cambridge, as opposed to putting it in the mail and having, hoping that it gets to us prior to Wednesday, and then we can get it out to you so that there's enough time for you to fill out the ballot, sign it, and get it back in so that it counts. So the important thing about that is to put it in a drop box. We'll get it that day. We pick up from the drop boxes a minimum of twice a day, depending on the location, sometimes 3 times a day. For example, at City Hall is a real hot spot for people dropping off their ballots. So we often check that 3 times a day to make sure we're getting the ballots out and getting them in the system. And once we pick them up and get them in the system, you can go online and track your ballot. So, and that's important so that you know that it's in. One of the things that we encourage people to do is call us. If your ballot isn't in, call us, and we will try to help you figure out where your ballot is and what needs to happen so that it appears online and you have access to how it's being tracked and what's happening with it. So we're pretty happy with the turnout that we're getting so far. Let me go back. 26,000 people have already cast their ballots. And that includes about 8,700 who have voted in person, which is still going on and will go on through the 30th at 5 p.m. It ends. You can vote in person at one of 3 sites in Cambridge. So we're getting a fairly healthy turnout with people coming in voting. with physically distancing and feeling safe and actually having a good time. You know, people having to talk a little louder because they're a little further apart, and that's okay. But people are getting out, and the people are voting at a pretty good clip, because if you have 73 registered voters and you mailed out 36,000 already, you know, you're almost looking at 50%. Oh,
And I
no.
hope everybody, Larry, I hope everybody is talking a little louder with a mask on, right?
Oh, most definitely. You know, we encourage it. There are some etiquette that we ask people to follow when they come into the voting site, which is to wear a mask. If they don't have a mask, we have a mask that we can give them. We have the distance. In fact, several of the sites moved due to our COVID environment that we wanted to make sure that everyone not only feels safe, but is safe. So we moved several voting locations to get the physical distance that we need to comply with the COVID guidelines to make everyone safe while they're voting. So, I don't know if this is a good time, but I want to give a shout out, Manikka, to the school system and your group of folks who made it possible that we use the schools to vote in, which is pretty important. And I'm getting some really good feedback on the polling sites being in the school. But I know we might talk about that a little later as well.
Yeah, well, you know, Larry, I know, of course, I speak for myself, and I know my colleagues and we all unanimously voted to approve those locations in our school district, in addition to making sure that the day was off for our schools, our school students and staff, to make sure that everyone is safe, particularly in the time of COVID. You know, it takes a village to ensure that our democracy continues to move forward. And, you know, on that, I really want to hear Anthony. Anthony, tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing and what's the strategy when it comes to the Democratic Party, particularly in the context of COVID-19, with trying to get people to the polls.
Yeah, so what I have seen is that a lot of their outreach, a lot of their, attempts to get people on the phones to talk to them about who they're going to vote for and making sure that they're going to vote is really based in relational organizing. I know Larry mentioned this a little bit about knowing people who register to vote and everything, but the Democratic Party, at least in Massachusetts, from what I've seen this year, has really, really heavily focused on reaching out to your own personal networks, talking to folks that you know, talking to your family, talking to your friends. And they've also, thought of a lot of really, really innovative relational organizing strategies. And I think that that's kind of the direction we've seen people going in over the last few years. I have particularly used a number of relational organizing apps that focus on, who's in your contact list, who can you reach out to personally, and use that personal connection to get them to go out and vote. And I think that it's been really effective. I think that it's fair to say that the solid focus on relational organizing was a big part of Senator Markey's primary victory. And I think that that's the way we should have been going. And I'm very glad that we've started to realize the importance of it and the effectiveness of it. Although it's unfortunate that it took a pandemic where we can't actually be out talking to each other to kind of realize this really vital campaign outreach strategy.
And Anthony, I've noticed, across the country, there have been, particularly in battleground states, there have been gatherings and pretty significant ones too. And of course, every state is very different as it relates to how the leadership is managing COVID. I feel like we're very fortunate to live in Massachusetts, where there's some very clear guidelines that come from the state level as it relates to how we should be approaching this pandemic. But I'm really curious, do you think that Massachusetts will get to the point where, the context of, really bringing people together in any significant way will be back on the table in the context of this pandemic?
Sorry, can you repeat your question? I feel like I.
So do you think that we'll be having large gatherings? Do you think the Democratic Party locally here will be bringing people together to really mobilize the base? I've seen it in other places, but we have not quite gone down that street in the same way that they have in battleground states. So I'm just kind of curious, what's the thinking at the state level?
Yeah. So we've definitely had a few not big gatherings, but we've had some small social distance gatherings outside. But in my opinion, I don't think we should be doing any kind of big gatherings with large amounts of people. I think that it's just too much of a risk. I've even on the campaign I was working on in the primary, insisted that we not even knock on any doors or anything, because I just don't think that it's worth it. I think that there are so many other ways that we can reach people where they are that doesn't put them at risk for contracting this virus. I think that obviously, some of the other outreach strategies that are present need some refining. We need to actually work to make them effective. But I don't think that we have any real big rallies or gatherings or anything scheduled. And in my opinion, we shouldn't.
So Elizabeth, I know that you've been organizing at the local level here in Cambridge and really building off of what Anthony said as it relates to galvanizing people, particularly locally, to vote. But you've also been doing some work as it relates to battleground states, which I have participated in. I jumped on the phone and called some people in Arizona, actually. So Elizabeth, tell us more about how you're galvanizing Cambridge voters to have an impact on this election.
Sure. First off, thanks for having me, Manikka and Denise. Really glad to be here. So yeah, I'm wearing two hats, both as the vice chair for the Cambridge Dems, and then also as a coordinator for the Cambridge for Biden-Harris. So in Cambridge, we're galvanizing and organizing our volunteers we're trying to build community in this virtual world. We're having phone banks that are on Zoom and bringing folks together. Normally we would be in a campaign office, but we're trying to create community. So we all check in, chat a little bit about politics, and then we get to phone banking, and we're calling the battleground states. We're calling Pennsylvania and Arizona and North Carolina as big ones. But it has been a strange time to gather volunteers. We're seeing the anxiety about making phone calls. A lot of people love knocking on doors. I was just in New Hampshire yesterday, and the Biden-Harris campaign has figured out how to do contactless, COVID-safe canvassing. So you're not actually talking to anyone at the door, but you're leaving all the information about how to vote for them with a targeted list. So that's pretty exciting to be able to make sure we're getting those people who we couldn't get on the phones to give them the information about voting at the door. We're also doing, to organize our Cambridge folks, we've been doing postcard letter writing with Swing Left. They are putting together this big send to send to voters in the battleground states, especially Georgia and Pennsylvania, North Carolina, especially marginalized communities. So they know that they're getting the proper information about where do they vote, if their polling location changed, and what they need to know about voting. So yeah, that's been very exciting.
Denise, how have you been engaged in this whole process as we get closer to Election Day? What are some of your thoughts as it relates to GOTV in the context of COVID? You're on mute, Denise.
Thanks for asking. Because we also have a quick question, but let me answer your question first. What I have been doing on my family, first of all, my family, we all get together, about 7 of us, and we decide who and how we're going to vote. And we kind of make a game of it, like we're all kind of running who can get their ballot in the mail and who can get it to the mailbox first. But beyond that, what I personally been doing is a lot of what Anthony talked about, which is relational organizing, you know, looking at the people that I have in my email list, on my in my contacts, just to say things like, oh, today is kicks off early voting day. Have you gotten out there and voted? When every time one of my family members went and cast that ballot, we would put it on Facebook just to remind people, because people get busy. They get busy and they intend to, but they don't. So really trying to, and I think, Anthony, why they hadn't come up with the idea of relational outreach before, that's what most people do, you know, in the sales world, is you start with the people, you know, we call them our center of influence. So I take my center of influence, there's about 100 people there, and find ways to contact them. Now, some people I don't reach out to you, Manikka, because I already know that you're doing it. But there are other people that love that extra reminder, you know, and then once you ask them, they'll say, oh yeah, Denise, thanks for reminding me. Now, the only difficult thing that's been for me around this outreach was the questions, not the question on ranked choice voting, but the question one, because all I knew really was what I was seeing on television. And so I called around to a few people, watched a few YouTube videos, and then came back with what I thought was the best answer. And I would sort of answer it like this: I can't say what you should do, but this is what I'm thinking. But to answer your question, I have found that very effective for two reasons. First of all, I get to talk to people I haven't talked to in ages, because we don't see each other because we're all in lockdown. But the most important thing, and they have appreciated the fact that I've reached out to them, not that they haven't forgotten about it, but they're concerned. A lot of people, not everyone I talk to is in Cambridge, and everyone's concerned, not so much about Massachusetts, but what's happening across the country. So what I don't probably know as much about, and maybe like we can hear more from Elizabeth about this, is how to tell them to connect if they feel comfortable reaching out. Now, I thought it was interesting when you said people who are kind of hesitant around phone banking. I think they'd be more hesitant around door knocking, because that would put them in contact with people. But I think I want to at least know where to tell people, this is what you can do. You can talk to Cambridge, you can talk to Mass Dems if you want to get more engaged. One of my friends sent out 4,010 postcards and letters. That was the way she was engaged. I said, and we all got together and said, right, that's so good. And other people thought about, wow, can I do that too? Because they didn't know about those ways. So one, reminding them to vote, and then also giving them ways that they can be involved. And the one thing I always like to say is, not only should you try to vote early if already gotten the ballot, kind of do whole family go, like I bring my granddaughter, you know, because it's also trying to make sure that the family knows this is an important thing to do, particularly if they can't vote right now, they get into the practice of going. So we do have a question. Should I pose it right now? You want me to hold on?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Okay. So someone said they were really happy to see that our numbers were high in terms of the ballots that have been cast, but you know, and we know that, or at least we don't believe that voter suppression is an issue here. So this is for all of you. Looking at some of the wards that are, I would call high minority or person of color districts, like 2-1, 5-3, 10-2, 11-3. Have you seen, in terms of the early voting numbers, is it trending anywhere? Are the votes coming out? Because if not, that might be something that we could do over the next couple of days, is find ways to make sure, remind those folks in those neighborhoods that, you know, election day is upon us.
Right. So right now we don't have, because as you know, we collect the ballots, but we can't open them yet to see exactly the location that they're coming from, which ward and precinct that they're coming from. But what I can tell you is that based on the locations of the drop boxes, and with some assumption that people are probably going to the closest drop boxes to them, City Hall is the most popular, well, probably the second most popular drop box outside of the one in front of the Election Commission.
Okay.
And both of those boxes are probably the closest to what you were saying before in terms of minority neighborhoods, Councilor Simmons, that we can come up with. So that, again, that's just me sort of, putting things together. But we will have those numbers. Well, probably won't get them till election night, actually.
We'll get them to election night. Okay. All right. Elizabeth, Anthony, do you want to comment on that at all? Any feelings, any trends that you're seeing? Particularly you, Anthony, that get the opportunity to have that sort of statewide look. Are you seeing any trends in the neighborhoods like Roxbury, Dorchester?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I feel like I'm running into a similar problem where I can't really see exactly where the ballots are coming in from. Although, I've definitely found some information regarding how many ballots have been cast, and it is definitely a larger than usual number of ballots that have been cast, particularly just overall. I'm not super well versed in Cambridge, but overall in Boston in particular.
Mm-hmm.
So I imagine that does mean that turnout has been increased there. I know for my part on the Markey/Mass Dems campaign, I've been especially focused on driving up turnout in those communities, focusing on individual precincts in Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, focusing on Chelsea, focusing on East Boston, because I do think it is really important that we see those neighborhoods that house communities of color see the biggest increases in voter turnout. That's my big goal for this election cycle.
Okay. Elizabeth, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, not necessarily on, I don't know that much about the voting side, but in terms of the volunteer side, I think one thing that we've been seeing, which isn't necessarily great, but that a lot of the people like on the volunteer list are majority white, and we are seeing folks of color. And I think that's something that's telling for both the Cambridge Dems and other communities, city committees, town committees who are part of the DNC, that, we can't necessarily just tell folks of color to go out and vote, but we as chairs of the party at whatever level, state, city, town, really need to be working and organizing and listening to the communities of color. That is continuous.
Elizabeth, I think that opens up a whole another conversation as it relates to whether the barriers that would allow people of color to volunteer, donate, and I would even say even run in the context of, where Denise and I enter this conversation, and just be a part of the political process, in general. Like, there are some serious barriers there that I think that at some point, particularly, it seems like the Democratic as well as the Republican Party need to have a serious conversation about, as well as just election commissions in general across the Commonwealth. And I think that sets us up for our next question. Quite honestly, we live in this really uber progressive state, right? And the assumptions are that we are doing the things necessary to galvanize people and get them to the polls. But I know that there's opportunities for growth. So I want to start with Larry. I know that you are really passionate around what places should be open for voting locations. What are the things at the municipal level, the commission level, that we should be thinking about to expand the right to vote?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And I think you hit it right on the head, is accessibility to locations and making sure that those locations are in areas where we really do want to bring out the vote, and the people should have the right to vote. And, to put it bluntly, areas that in some ways have suffered the most from voter suppression. And that's why I've been on the Election Commission, which is an elected position. You have to run and get on it. Ever since I've been on it, I've been advocating that we should hold elections in schools. I think elections should be in public buildings, because that gives the appearance of that we as a people, we as a government are invested in making sure that everyone's right to vote is upheld. And most people know where their schools are in their area. And not to mention the educational benefit that I think comes from having elections in school and having that association put together. I know for a fact, in terms of the statistics, people who, the earlier you vote, the more likely, the sooner you vote, it's like if you're 18 and you start voting, you're going to continue voting throughout. And that's a big issue because what we see, the lower turnout is among the younger people. Now, this particular election, I must admit, I am very pleased with the turnout that we got from younger people to step up and work the polling sites. We had over 250 people say that they would be willing to work, and many of them just wanted to say they would volunteer. We actually pay poll workers, but I was so excited to see so many young people saying, hey, listen, I want to get involved, and that's really important. But I'm going back for a second. I think, so the schools check off several boxes. One, they're known entities in the community, and they're in areas where vote out sometimes is lower than others, but they do. Fortunately, we have schools in these areas as well. Schools are accessible because of the guidelines that they have to come under. So you cross off that box. A lot of people, we get a lot of calls and say, oh, put a polling area here, put a polling spot there. Why can't this location, given the COVID situation, businesses are down, go into businesses and take them over and turn them into polling sites. It's not that easy. It really isn't. And people have to agree that a site becomes a polling site. And there are a lot of guidelines based on the state requirements for something to be a polling site. So, and oftentimes schools check these boxes before you realize it. You say, hey, this actually may work. And I think one of the biggest things that people are talking about in terms of, it's another day away from school, but I think you turn it into an educational component. And if not, I know from some years in the school system, there are days that, we have teacher, where teachers have days that they work with students around the school. So you can easily put one of those days on voting day so that you can utilize the school buildings. And I think it would say a lot in terms of the openness and making people feel that there's less voter suppression as well if elections are held in public buildings.
Yeah, I know that even with the school system before COVID hit, that there were moments when there were elections, because there's so many. I mean, I think people think just presidential a lot of times, but there are so many other elections that take place in our school system. At certain sites, not all of them, welcome voting in, but because of COVID, we had to close school down for this particular election. So it'll be an interesting conversation with my colleagues. And I want to just fully acknowledge member Jose Luis, who led our Buildings and Grounds Committee, that led the conversation that then allowed us to make that decision around closing schools and opening our sites up for voting. It was, a quite significant thing to do. And it'll be interesting, being that, this pandemic, unfortunately, is not going anywhere anytime soon. But the person that's responsible for it, it is our hope that that person is going to go away really sometime really soon. And so, Anthony, I'm very curious, what's your perspective around how we should be thinking about this from the state level when it comes to expanding opportunities, particularly in communities of color, when it comes to accessing the right to vote?
Yeah, so I think that we definitely have this notion that Massachusetts is a super progressive state. We've got a really big veto-proof supermajority in the state house. We've got a really big veto-proof supermajority in the state Senate. But very frankly, we're not being proactive enough to re-enfranchise people. With the kind of numbers that we have in the legislature, with the fact that our Secretary of State is a Democrat, we should have things like same-day voter registration, election week, universal vote by mail, but it took a pandemic to get just one of those. And I think that it's a real shame. I mentioned this before, but it just really seems like our party, both the Massachusetts Democratic Party as well as the National Democratic Party, seems to be a little bit more focused on being reactive to instances of voter suppression rather than being proactive about re-enfranchising people who have had their voting rights disenfranchised or stolen from them. We need to be working to make sure that everyone who's in any position that there could possibly be has multiple options to vote on how to vote. I do think it's a shame that we haven't really been moving towards some of those more accessible ways of voting. But I do hope that now that we've seen the success of universal vote by mail, that we start to move towards implementing that permanently.
You're muted.
Yes, jump in, Larry.
Anthony, that I agree 100% with what you're saying. And one of the things that I would encourage you guys to do is to, even within the Commonwealth, look at the places whereby they close schools on voting days to allow people to vote. Now, that is not true in all communities, but I would be curious to know how that plays in terms of any potential type of voter suppression type thing. Denise will tell you I'll be going back to my political roots in a minute here.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's important because I know there are several communities in the Commonwealth that on voting day, they close the schools automatically. And I'm not sure why we don't look at that as a Commonwealth as a whole to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to get out and vote.
Isn't it the case in some countries that election day is just a holiday? You don't even have
absolutely.
You know,
Now, I think you got to look at it.
Why don't we do that? Why don't we really just, you want to talk about closing the schools on election day, not having the schools open so that they can be open to vote. Why don't we just have election day, the day that it's a day off, but it's a day on. You get on your bike, you get on your feet or in your car, and you go and you vote. And if you don't do nothing else, that's your chief primary thing to do on this particular day. So I'm always curious. There are countries that have so far less than we do, and they figure that out, but we can't. But let me give you another follow-up question that came in on my text message, if I may. And this is sort of directed to you, Larry. So because of COVID-19 and social distancing, you changed a lot of the polling places.
That's right.
A number of those polling places were senior buildings, 2050 Mass Avenue, to name just one of them. I can't think of, I think 3050 Churchill might have been close. I don't recall all of them. This is raised because, let me see, Senior citizens are one of the largest voting blocks we've seen in our city and, across the state and country. What will we be doing to make it easier for them to vote? So I guess what this person is saying is that it was, if you lived at 2050, 3050 Churchill, 55 Essex, that I'm still on fire, that you closed that one, but that's not a voting place. And I know it's too small.
Right.
But if once we get past this pandemic, having senior citizens that are in the area of Central Square all going to the fire station, which in inclement weather isn't good. And I know they do, or when someone told me, well, that's what the candidates are supposed to do. You're supposed to take them to the polls. And I'm saying, why make it difficult? So I kind of want to throw that out is, schools are great. I agree. They're always big. It teaches the kids about voting and all of that. But I'm also interested in making we don't disenfranchise senior citizens, as this question basically asks, because now we've taken the voting that was right downstairs in their house, and they could go in their bunny slippers away from them.
Right. So there's two things. One, the biggest thing in this particular election is the COVID, and having to follow the guidelines, which makes sense. I mean, we all agree we want to wear a mask, and seniors are one of the most vulnerable populations,
Right.
so that it makes it very difficult to have it there without the spacing distance, the lack of space that you have in some of the centers. And in addition, quite frankly, not everybody who is in charge of the senior places necessarily want to have voting polls there. I was just putting it out there. So
let us know who it is. I think I'll make a call.
And I think, again, that just speaks to the fact that, we think that, oh, you could just put up a polling place. Well, actually, you can't. And it's not as easy as one would think, because, we all would think, well, hell, everybody wants everybody to vote. Yes, but maybe not.
Any thoughts on that from either of you, Elizabeth or Anthony, about enfranchising senior citizens? That in this case, if I were to read into this question, people are saying, but now you've taken it for the right reason. You've now taken this easy opportunity for us away from us. Now we have to go to a greater extent to do the same thing that we were accustomed to, going to the elevator, going downstairs, and ta-da, I voted.
So if I could just add one more thing, I know other people might want to, and that is the importance of just being able to vote by mail.
Okay.
Have a situation where there should be no excuse voting by mail. Right now, up until this election, you had to give a reason to have an absentee ballot. You're going to be out of town. There's, and people just make up all kinds of things, but they shouldn't have to.
Right. Okay.
You shouldn't have to at all. You should just be able to say, I want a ballot, I'm going to vote. And particularly in the case of seniors, because if they are homebound and not able to get out, or I clearly understand and agree with you, Councilor Simmons, about it. Well, if it's right downstairs, they can go downstairs, but sometimes they can't even go downstairs. But they shouldn't be disenfranchised in any way, so that they should be allowed to say, hey, just send me my ballot, I'll vote and send it in, and let's be done with it.
Good point. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I had on primary day, I was calling voters, and I spoke to this woman who was disabled and a senior citizen, and she used to vote, and this is exactly what we're talking about, and was just sort of exemplifying the issue. She used to vote very close, but her polling location moved to an elementary school. Right. And no shade on the different campaigns or the election commission, but she didn't have a way to get to the polling location. And so the Markey campaign was offering Lyft rides, but it wouldn't cover a Lyft ride home. And so I was talking to other volunteers, and we just ended up sending her a Lyft from one of our accounts. And so she could go vote, but it was, she didn't know her polling location was gonna change. And so she was thinking she would just go next door, and wasn't able to do that. And if someone hadn't called her, then I don't know, she really wanted to vote, and that's what she did every election. But she didn't have the money to get a Lyft. She was worried still, even though she said, I really want to vote. I know this is, she was a little scared, as someone who is very vulnerable to COVID, to get into a car, but she wanted to vote. And it was, I'm hoping it was great that she was able to vote, but it was exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah. And it takes education, and if you've been going downstairs forever in a day, and for as long as I've been in elected office, 3050 was a voting place, 2050 was a voting place, 150 Erie was a voting place, 9 Lambert Street was a voting place. And again, I understand why you would take it off the rolls, because you want people to be safe. But by doing that inadvertently, and again, this is not blaming anybody, so we have to really think about maybe what Anthony says, starting very early with a campaign to senior citizens to say, You may not be able to go to where you downstairs, but you can vote by mail. Take advantage of it, because I don't want them to feel disenfranchised, because no one's going to, we thought about it, a few of us, we could give rights, but we don't want to jeopardize a senior citizen by exposing them to us, because who knows who's sick until they get sick, or they get tested and they're told that they're sick. So I think, again, this is not anything we would call voter suppression on the one hand, but it's a deterrent.
Yeah, well, you know what, Denise, it's a ripple effect from the pandemic.
Okay,
And
thank you.
And so, anyone that's in, any type of elected office right now, or position where they have to make these types of decisions, there's all these unintended consequences. When you make one decision regarding, the pandemic, it then have a ripple effect on all these other things. And I know this very intimately in the context of schools right now. But fighting this pandemic is really taking a step back and having a conversation around a series of trade-offs. And so in the context of voting, we know that we needed to make these trade-offs. We were a part of that conversation on the school side, and in conversation with the election commission, and these political campaigns and nonpartisan entities then have to respond to our current reality and push people out and get them to the polls. So I'm curious, as it relates to the Democratic Party, how are they managing these massive hurdles when it comes to COVID-19 and trying to meet these, really unique ripple effects, i.e. seniors being able to get to a polling location that was easily accessible before, really galvanizing communities of color when you know that they are highly impacted by COVID-19, and not wanting to put them at risk, and making sure that they're safe and getting them to the polls. So I'm just curious from, Anthony's perspective, how's the Democratic Party thinking about this in your coordinated campaign effort?
Yeah, so we have definitely been trying to jump over all of these hurdles as much as we can, because like you pointed out, there's just so many of them, and they all have their own little ripple effect that combines into a greater ripple effect. But we have really made a big push to, in particular, the changing polling locations. One of the things that we make sure to do is we include that on our phone banks for each person, so that the volunteer can literally just say, all right, and your polling location is this, so that if there's any change, the voter is aware of it immediately. We have been intentional about trying to make sure that seniors go out to vote, because, or that they get their votes counted, whether that be by mailing in their ballot or dropping it in a drop box. Those have been kind of the things that we've been really focused on, because seniors are at such a higher risk from this disease, but they're still, one of the strongest voting blocks by far. So we have definitely been keeping an eye on a lot of these hurdles. I think that we have a number of strategies that are specifically focused on getting around them as much as we can. But at the end of the day, these issues, there's only so much you can do to get around them. We can only mitigate the harm as much as we can, but we can't actually totally remove the harm, no matter how much work that we do, once those institutional hurdles are in place.
And Larry, can you just, I'm going to come to you, Elizabeth, but I want to hear from Larry. Can you just talk specifically about election day voting? Because I want people to know the things that the Election Commission put in place to ensure people's safety, of course, with early voting, which is taking place now. But for, the day of, what are the things that are being put in place to ensure the safety of voters?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. So typically when you go into a polling site, we'll take it from, showing up. So once you show up, we actually have marked the ground with little round circles for the 6 feet distancing. But once you get in, typically when you go in, there's usually 2 people sitting at the check-in table, a 6 foot long check-in table. Now each person has their own check-in table. So we create the distance. There's a shield in front of the check-in table, as well as we put sanitizer there, and there are gloves that people can use. We have people wiping down the pins as people using as they go in and out. In the past, we try to get as many voting booths in there as we can. Now there's like 3. And then you have somebody standing at every point helping people to navigate it and to, even get them in and out. We have the situation where you come in one way, you go out another way, as to limit the passing of people and mitigate some of the possible contact that has to take place. So it's slowing it down, just to be open and transparent and fair about it. It does slow it down. We're asking people to be patient, because we want to make sure that everyone votes. And that also, highlights the even more important that if you just drop your ballot off at one of the drop-off box, or you vote early, it takes the pressure off of the same day voting, which, by looking at the numbers, as I just said earlier, the numbers of people going to vote in person will be reduced this year, which is a good thing, and we'll be able to start. This is the first year we're actually going to be able to start processing the early votes that we've gotten in starting this week. Actually, we won't be releasing any results or anything, obviously, but we will begin to process some of those ballots that have already come in. So we're bringing on, there's extra people. I typically hire, anywhere between 50 and 60 people to help at the polling sites during an election year. I'm bringing on 70 people for my 9 polling sites that we have, to make sure there's enough people there so that everybody can keep cool. There's not anybody doing 10 jobs. And there's people there to help people and facilitate the voting process. So if people need PPE, we have it. It'll be there. It'll be ready. Our workers have, face masks, face shields, gloves, sanitizer. So we're doing everything to make sure that everybody is safe and that everybody still has a rewarding voting experience. Because I remember going, with my parents. I know Denise and I, we've talked about in the past, when we got dragged to the polls, and it was like, whoa, this is serious business. So again, you start early and you see it, you continue it. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah, and I just want to, fully acknowledge all of the work that's coming from our election commission. With the protocols that were put in place, I felt safe enough to bring my whole family, which I traditionally do. We rock together with all of these things. We vote together. When my babies are tiny, I bring them in the booth with me, because I want to instill that in them at a very young age. So thank you for that, for making me feel safe to be able to bring my whole family to the polls and keep that tradition alive within my own family. And I also want to just take the time to thank our high school students, our CRLS students that have been volunteering. Thank you for stepping up and being poll workers. I know that in collaboration with the Election Commission, that there was a voter registration drive held yesterday, because it was the last day for registrations, to make sure that all of our seniors or anyone 18 that's still in our school system had the opportunity to vote. So special shout out to our student school committee members and our administration for making that happen. Elizabeth, before we close out with final comments, I just want to hear from you as it relates to the engagement that you're doing. How are you having conversations with volunteers? Because you are having Cambridge volunteers call other states that do not have the same level of culture and intentionality around COVID connected to get out.
We have 2 questions in the chat too, if we can get to them. So I just
Sure, absolutely. So Elizabeth, can you tell us how you're threading that line, and then we'll get to those questions before we close out.
Wait, can you repeat the question?
Sure. So how are you engaging your volunteers in these battleground states that we know don't have the same protocols and procedures around addressing COVID-19 and taking it as seriously as we do in Massachusetts with encouraging people to get out to the polls and vote?
That's a great question. Yeah, we've been calling a lot of the states, particular Arizona and Florida, who, the state, their county is not taking COVID seriously. And so the Biden campaign has given us information about how to help these people and to think through their voting plan. So a lot of it is what Larry was saying, that, they have all these voters in these battleground states have to think of is, when can you go? And what, do you have the PPE? And letting them know what the practices are, like talking through with them about, well, you have a elderly grandmother who would like to go vote. How do you do that? Let's look up and see if you can bring that person's ballot with you. We unfortunately have found some states that are giving misinformation to their voters in predominantly communities of color about how people are able to vote. So, and people are really worried about COVID. So it's talking through with these voters, like, how do you do that? Can you drop it off in a ballot box? Do you have masks? Okay, let's make sure you just have one person going. If everyone can just give that one person the ballot and they go and they're the younger person in the household. So we are thinking through that with the help of the Biden campaign, but it is really challenging because a lot of people, they want to go vote. They're really worried that the postal service will not get their vote there in time, or there's active voter suppression in their community. So that's what we do a lot, especially in Pennsylvania, is talk to the voters about how they're going to be safe, especially if their town and election commission don't have the proper protection.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Denise, the questions.
Two quick questions. One around seniors. The senior citizen assumed that they were going to vote in person. Should they not feel, coming up on the actual election, feel like they can't get to the polls? Do they have any alternative at that late date? Okay, I'm a senior citizen. I was going to go vote in person, not feeling up to it 2 or 3 days before election day. I missed all the, is there a shot for me to vote?
Well, on election day, if they come up to the
but I'm not feeling good. So I'm not feeling, it says let me get it right. They intended to vote in person. Okay, here we go. Where is it? They want to vote, they planned on it, and it's now unclear how they can safely get to the polls because they're not feeling that well. That's it. I'm sorry.
Okay. So from the election commission perspective, we can't obviously provide rides to people to get to the polls. If they weren't feeling well and they got to the polls and they made that known, they would not be waiting in a line. We would make sure that they got up to the front and got in to vote. I would think Anthony and Elizabeth might be able to add in terms of some ways people could get to the polls on voting day. At that point, if it's voting day, their only option would be to come into the poll. They couldn't get a ballot and send it in at that point.
Okay. And the last question I think is for you, Larry, is I'm in line at the polls, but I'm not, it's 8 o'clock, but I've already been in line. Do I still get to vote?
Absolutely. So the way it works is that, if the line is 2 miles long, what will happen is at 8 o'clock, the police officer calls the election time and they say it's 8 o'clock. They will go stand behind the last person in line. So if that line goes around the block 4 times, they'll go get behind the last person, and everybody in the line before 8 o'clock will vote.
I thought that was the answer, but I'm gonna let the expert answer that. Okay.
Yeah.
Those were the questions in the queue, and I wanted to make sure I kind of pushed them in before we closed it down.
Yeah, no, thank you, Denise, for that. Teamwork makes the dream work with this operation we have going on here, right?
It
So,
does.
in our closing, because I know that we're right on the hour, I just want to give everyone 1 minute to just give us your final thoughts as it relates to the importance of this election. And Elizabeth and Anthony, if there are some answers to that question around rides to the polls and information you can provide, please do so. So let's start with Anthony. Your thoughts. What should we be thinking about as we go to the polls next week?
Yeah. So I first off wanted to thank you guys for inviting me to this again. This was a really great event that you all put on, and so I just really appreciate being included in it. And I think that the thing that people need to really think about as they go towards the polls in the next 9 days is vote for the future. Is don't look at this cycle as the end all be all. I'm not super happy with who the nominee is, but I'm really excited to be able to push the nominee, if he wins, to be progressive, to pass progressive legislation. I'm really excited to activate these communities that generally don't vote or vote in lower numbers, in the hopes that they get on board with the progressive legislation that we need for the next cycle and the cycle after that. So I think that the thing that everyone needs to be thinking of is the future, is not 2020, but is 2021 and 2022 and 2023 and 2024. And one thing that I just want to mention regarding the question Denise put forward about if a senior citizen is planning to vote on election day, then realizes they don't feel up for it on election day. Everyone at this point in time, even if you're planning to vote on election day, even if you're planning to vote early, even if you've made the plan, all that stuff, should be planning for contingencies. Even if you're saying you're going to vote in person, request your absentee ballot. I got so many people on election day in the primary because I was working in Chelsea, which was a hot spot. Folks who said that they had been planning to vote on election day who then tested positive and were forced to quarantine, and then weren't able to vote because they hadn't requested their absentee ballot in time. So folks just need to be prepared for any possibility and have a contingency plan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
Well, first off, yeah, thank you very much, Denise and Manikka, for the invitation. Really appreciate and really glad to be here. So my answer is very partisan, but this is what I tell the phone bankers every night and talk to the voters, is like, this is what the 4 years we've been working on. This is what we've been working on for years. And, the feeling that we have 9 days. I just sent out an email saying we have 9 days. This is it. And this is your moment to either go to the polls, make some phone calls, make sure you have that contingency plan, make sure the senior citizens in your life have a plan also, see how you can support them, because this is it. Your vote matters so much in this election.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Larry, what do you have for us?
I think that people get out and vote. I would encourage as many people as possible to vote early. Go to one of 3 voting sites, which are on the website, Cambridge Election Commission, to vote early as possible so that you don't have to worry about whether your vote's going to get in on time. I think that's a great suggestion, Neil, for people. If they want to, you can get an absentee ballot, but you can still go to the poll and vote, and it will just be canceled out, the absentee ballot that you were sent. But I'm just encouraging and hoping that as many people as possible get out and vote, get out and vote, get out and vote. And I want to thank you both for hosting this wonderful forum and getting the word out. Well, you know what I think of both of you, so.
I'll take it, Larry. I'll take it. For me, I think this is such a monumental election. And I remember, 5 years ago now when 45 decided to run. And, I said then, I'm like, I don't think people appreciate how devastating it would be if this person got in office. And I'm going to be really partisan here now. You fast forward to today, and there are over 200,000 plus Americans that have died. These are more people have died from COVID than have died in the Vietnam War. Let that like sink in for a second, right? And so, you know,
3 times more than the Vietnam War. You know that, right? So
yeah.
Denise and I, we know.
Yeah, it's significantly, it's just more. And for that disconnect as it relates to public sentiment around that simple fact, it says a lot about where we are and what we've taken for granted as it relates to our ability to be able to shape who's in office. And it saddened me, 5 years ago that we took that for granted, but we have an opportunity now to correct that mistake. And, I'm excited for the Biden-Harris ticket. I'm pushing it forward. Anthony probably knows I probably had a different person in the primary, but that's behind us now. And we are moving forward and ready to bring back the humanity of just being able to lead our nation back, because that was lost. So I'm really excited about these early numbers. And if we can keep pushing to next week, November 3rd, this is one small thing that Denise and I do, in addition to other things, to make sure that people know the value and importance of their voice and their vote. And we are just encouraging people to take heed, take your power, own your power, have a contingency plan, because this pandemic is still very real. And if you get sick, then that will interfere with your ability to be able to cast your vote. So, take this moment very seriously, the intersection of the pandemic as well as this election, and do whatever's in your power to make sure that we bring civility back to our nation. Denise, what do you have for us before we close out?
I want to build on something that Elizabeth said. First of all, thank you to our panelists, and thank you, Manikka, for keeping doing this work, because I know you have 12 jobs. I'm trying to juggle them all. But something that you said, we have been working for 3 years or for 4 years for this day. And that's what people have to remember. We've been working for this day. We don't get November 3rd over. If it doesn't go our way, we don't get it. Say, oh, didn't go our way. Let's do it again. That's the message I've been telling everybody. We don't get November 3rd back. So we have to make it count now. So that's the message I really want people to know is go through your circle of influence. Make sure all your friends and everyone that you know voted. And if they haven't, tell them how. And I love that idea, Anthony, about that contingency plan, which I never thought about it. We may be not in a good place at this point, but any other thing that we can think of to help people get to the polls. I think I'm going to work on some of my senior friends that say, have you voted? Can you vote? Do you need support and vote? Do you need me to get a cab for you so you can vote? Whatever ways can get them to the polls. But again, the most important thing is our vote is our voice. And when we do not use our vote, we are silenced. And silence for us is death. And so we have to, as African-American people, realize that what legacy do we want our children to have? If we don't do it, we can't expect them to do it. And so we really have to be uber engaged in having our voices heard. Again, thank you to CCTV. Thank you to our guests. And I hope that you'll tune in with us, because we do really enjoy doing this and reaching out to people. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about wellness. Stress is running high in the African-American community with what's happening in terms of Black Lives Matter, our lives and our safety, as well as COVID-19. So we're going to hope to have an engaging program with you on the idea of wellness, managing stress in this on these stressful times. Manikka, back to you.
Well, thank you to our panelists. We look forward to continuing the conversation. And thank you to our viewing audience. It's really a privilege to be able to have these conversations and engage the citizens of Cambridge and beyond. So thank you. Come back again. Stay tuned, and we'll let you know more information about our next program around Black Cambridge and COVID-19. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, don't forget to vote. Bye.
Bye.